They called it the Flying Porcupine. When German Luftwaffe pilots first encountered the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress in combat over Europe, they were confronted with a terrifying reality that would fundamentally alter aerial warfare. It wasn't merely the size of this American bomber that stunned them. It was the unprecedented concentration of defensive firepower that seemed to bristle from every angle of its aluminum frame. In the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe, German fighter pilots accustomed to swift victories against Allied bombers suddenly found themselves flying into storms of coordinated 50-caliber machine gun fire with no safe approach vector to their target. This was no ordinary bomber. This was a fortress with wings. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The clash between German fighter pilots and the B-17 Flying Fortress represents one of the most consequential aerial confrontations in military history. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany would become one of the defining elements of the Allied victory in Europe, but its success hinged on the ability of American bombers to reach their targets and return home. The B-17, with its revolutionary defensive capabilities, made this possible, but at a staggering cost in human lives on both sides. The story begins in the pre-dawn darkness of August 17, 1942. At airfields across eastern England, ground crews worked frantically in the dim light of hooded lamps, loading bombs and ammunition into the massive B-17E and F model flying fortresses of the United States 8th Air Force. This would be the first American heavy bomber raid against Nazi-occupied Europe, a daylight precision bombing mission against the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen, France. For the German Luftwaffe pilots who would rise to intercept them, it would provide their first encounter with a weapon system that would change the nature of aerial combat. Oberleutnant Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II Richthofen was one of the first Luftwaffe pilots to face this new threat. Having already claimed numerous victories against British fighters and bombers, Meyer was confident in the capabilities of his Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the most formidable fighter aircraft of the war. As he climbed into the cockpit that morning, he had no inkling that he was about to confront a defensive system unlike anything he had previously encountered. We had heard rumors of a new American bomber, Meyer would later recall in a debriefing report filed in the archives of the Luftwaffe High Command. But nothing prepared us for what we encountered that day. As I made my approach from what I believed was a blind spot, I suddenly found myself flying through a web of tracers coming from multiple guns, from positions I hadn't even identified. The experience of Meyer and his fellow pilots that day would force an immediate reassessment of Luftwaffe fighter tactics. The B-17's defensive armament, particularly in the E and F models that first appeared over Europe, consisted of up to 13 50-caliber Browning machine guns, strategically positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that protected the bomber from nearly every angle of attack. This represented a fundamental shift in air combat. Previous bombers relied primarily on escort fighters for protection. The B-17 was designed to defend itself as part of a mutually supporting formation. To understand the psychological impact this had on German pilots, one must appreciate the context of aerial warfare as it had evolved by 1942. The Luftwaffe had enjoyed overwhelming success during the early years of the war, developing tactics that had proven devastatingly effective against previous generations of Allied bombers. German fighter pilots were trained to approach from a bomber's blind spots, deliver a concentrated burst of fire, and then break away before the target's limited defensive armament could respond effectively. The B-17 changed this calculus entirely. There were virtually no blind spots from which to approach safely. The standard American combat box formation, with bombers flying in staggered groups of 18 to 21 aircraft, created an even more formidable defensive network, with hundreds of heavy machine guns creating a virtual wall of lead through which attacking fighters had to fly. Major Werner Mulders, one of Germany's top fighter aces until his death in November 1941, had developed the tactical doctrine used by the Luftwaffe's fighter force. His successor, Adolf Galland, would later write, "We had never seen anything like it. The Americans flew in formation, relying on the concentrated firepower of their defensive armament rather than on escort fighters. When our pilots attacked as they had been trained to do, they found themselves flying into a coordinated defense that seemed to have no weaknesses." The B-17's reputation quickly spread among Luftwaffe pilots. They gave it nicknames that reflected their respect and fear: Fliegende Stachelschwein, flying porcupine, and Fliegendes Totenkopf, flying death's head. Luftwaffe pilot Franz Stigler, who would survive the war with 28 confirmed victories, later recounted, "The first time I attacked a B-17, I was shocked by the firepower. I came in from what I thought was a good angle, and suddenly my cockpit was surrounded by tracers. My aircraft was hit several times. I pulled away, convinced that if I had continued my approach, I would not have survived." The physical and psychological challenges faced by German pilots attacking B-17 formations were compounded by the harsh realities of high-altitude combat. At the typical engagement altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet, temperatures dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius. Oxygen was scarce, and the thin air made aircraft handling more difficult. German fighters, particularly the earlier models of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, struggled with high-altitude performance compared to their American counterparts. Oberstleutnant Joachim Müncheberg, a highly decorated Luftwaffe ace, reported after an engagement with B-17s in late 1942, "The Americans fly higher than we expected. Our engines lose power at these altitudes, while their bombers seem to maintain their performance. This gives them an additional advantage beyond their defensive firepower." As 1942 turned to 1943, the scale of the aerial battle over Europe expanded dramatically. The 8th Air Force in England grew from a handful of bomber groups to a massive force capable of putting hundreds of B-17s over a target in a single raid. The psychological impact on German pilots intensified as they faced not just individual fortresses, but vast formations that filled the sky with aircraft and defensive fire. Hauptmann Egon Mayer, who had survived that first encounter, developed new tactics that would eventually prove more effective against the flying fortress. Rather than attacking from behind, where the B-17's tail, dorsal, and waist guns created a particularly deadly firing arc, Mayer pioneered the head-on attack. Coming in from 12 o'clock high, German fighters would fire at the relatively vulnerable nose of the bomber, then slide underneath to avoid the heaviest defensive fire. "The Americans expected us to attack from behind or from the side," Mayer wrote, in a tactical assessment that circulated among Luftwaffe fighter units in early 1943. "When we come at them head-on, we have several advantages. The closing speed is very high, giving their gunners little time to track us. Their nose armament is less concentrated than their rear defenses, and if we time our brake correctly, we can pass under the formation before most guns can bear on us." The head-on attack became standard procedure for Luftwaffe units, but it required nerves of steel. The closing speed between a B-17 flying at 200 mph and a FW-190 or Bf-109 approaching at over 350 mph could exceed 600 mph, giving the German pilot only a split-second window to aim and fire before having to veer away to avoid collision. Many didn't make it. Mid-air collisions claimed the lives of numerous German pilots who misjudged their approach or whose aircraft were damaged by defensive fire at the critical moment when evasive action was needed. Lieutenant Heinz Knock, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who faced B-17s repeatedly, described the terror of the head-on attack in his post-war memoirs. "You see the fortress growing larger in your gun sight. You open fire at 500 meters and keep firing as you close. At 200 meters, You can see the American gunners returning fire, their tracers reaching for you. At 100 meters, you must break away or die, either from collision or from their fire. In that moment, time seems to stand still. You are committed to your course. There is no turning back. The psychological strain on German pilots was immense. Unlike their American counterparts who rotated back to the United States after completing a set number of missions, initially 25, later raised to 30, and then 35, Luftwaffe pilots were expected to fly until they were killed, seriously wounded, or physically unable to continue. The cumulative stress of repeated confrontations with B-17 formations took a heavy toll. Hauptmann Wilhelm Hoffmann of Jagdgeschwader 1 wrote in his diary after a particularly brutal engagement in May 1943, "Today we lost 5 pilots attacking a formation of B-17s. The Americans lost 3 bombers. At this rate, we will run out of pilots long before they run out of bombers." The men know this, and it affects their morale. Some of the younger pilots are beginning to hesitate before closing with the bombers. They have seen too many of their comrades fail to return. As the air war intensified, the Germans began to deploy more specialized weapons to counter the B-17 threat. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G 6R6 was equipped with 20mm cannon gondolas under the wings, giving it greater firepower at the cost of maneuverability. The Focke-Wulf FW 190A8R2 Sturmbach battering ram variant carried heavy armor plating to protect the pilot during close approaches to bomber formations, along with 30mm cannons capable of downing a B-17 with a single, well-placed hit. Most feared by American bomber crews was the Messerschmitt Me 410 Ornisse Hornet, which carried the devastating BK-5 50mm cannon. With a 5-round magazine, this massive weapon could destroy a B-17 from beyond the effective range of its defensive machine guns. Fortunately for the Americans, the Me-410 was produced in limited numbers and was vulnerable to escort fighters due to its relative lack of maneuverability. The Germans also experimented with rocket weapons. The Werfer Granit 21, a 21-to-1 guided rocket, could be fired from a safe distance, outside the range of the B-17's defensive armament. Luftwaffe pilot Heinz Baer recalled, "The rocket weapons gave us a psychological advantage. We could attack from a safer distance, but accuracy was poor, and you still had to get relatively close to have a reasonable chance of hitting the target." Despite these innovations, the Luftwaffe struggled to develop a comprehensive solution to the B-17 threat. The fundamental problem remained. The bombers were exceptionally durable, their defensive fire was devastating, and they operated in formations that multiplied these advantages. The cost to the Luftwaffe in aircraft and irreplaceable experienced pilots continued to mount. The psychological impact extended beyond the fighter pilots to the highest levels of the Luftwaffe command. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, became increasingly frustrated with the inability of his fighter force to prevent American bombing raids. In a famous outburst after American bombers struck targets deep in Germany in 1943, Göring reportedly shouted at his fighter commanders, "I'd rather you called them flying coffins than flying fortresses." Yet the reality was that the B-17, particularly when deployed in proper formation, lived up to its formidable name. The true turning point in the air war over Europe came with the introduction of long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 and early 1944. Now the B-17s were not only formidably armed themselves, but were also protected by some of the best fighter aircraft of the war. The psychological pressure on German pilots intensified further, as they had to contend with both the defensive fire of the bomber formations and the aggressive tactics of American fighter pilots, eager to add to their victory tallies. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commander of Jagdgeschwader 54, issued a somber assessment to his pilots in February 1944. "We now face not only the most heavily armed bomber in the history of warfare, but also escort fighters that match or exceed the capabilities of our own aircraft. Every mission against the Americans must be approached with the utmost caution and precision. There is no margin for error." The human cost of the aerial battle was staggering on both sides. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force had lost over 2,000 B-17s and 20,000 airmen. German fighter losses were similarly devastating, with the additional critical factor that Germany was rapidly running out of experienced pilots. Training programs were shortened repeatedly to rush replacements to frontline units, resulting in novice pilots facing combat veterans in state-of-the-art aircraft, a recipe for disaster. The psychological dimension of this war of attrition cannot be overstated. American bomber crews knew they needed to complete a specific number of missions before being rotated home. This knowledge, while creating its own psychological pressures, at least provided a finish line, a goal to work towards. German pilots had no such perspective. Their tour of duty would end only in victory, defeat, death, or serious injury. This difference in psychological framing had profound effects on morale and performance. As one Luftwaffe psychologist noted in a report to the High Command in late 1943, our pilots are exhibiting increasing signs of combat fatigue and psychological strain. Unlike the enemy who can anticipate relief after a fixed number of missions, our men face an indefinite commitment that appears increasingly hopeless as the enemy grows stronger. This is affecting their operational effectiveness and willingness to close with enemy formations. The spring of 1944 brought a new phase of the air war as the Allied bombing campaign intensified in preparation for the invasion of Normandy. B-17 formations, now routinely escorted by P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, struck targets throughout Germany with increasing frequency and devastating effect. The psychological pressure on the remaining Luftwaffe pilots reached new heights as they faced overwhelming odds on every mission. Major Günter Rall, who would end the war as the third highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, later described this period. It was like trying to stop a flood with a broom. The Americans came in hundreds, then thousands of aircraft. Their fighters had fuel to reach Berlin and back. Our younger pilots were being shot down on their first or second mission. Veterans who had survived dozens of combats earlier in the war were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. We knew that we could not win this battle, yet we had to continue fighting. The culmination of the daylight strategic bombing campaign came with Big Week in February 1944, when the 8th Air Force, joined by the 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, launched a series of massive raids against German aircraft manufacturing facilities. Over 3,500 bomber sorties were flown, escorted by more than 2,000 fighter sorties. The Luftwaffe rose to defend its homeland, but suffered catastrophic losses. In a single week, German fighter strength was reduced by approximately 17%, with irreplaceable experienced pilots accounting for many of the casualties. A Luftwaffe situation report from March 1944 captured the grim reality. Fighter units are operating at 50 to 60% of authorized strength. Replacement pilots arrive with less than 160 flight hours compared to the 240 hours that was standard in 1942. Losses among these new pilots exceed 30% in their first 5 missions. Morale is deteriorating as pilots recognize the increasingly hopeless nature of their task. For the German pilots who had faced the B-17 from its first appearance over Europe, the progression had been stark. What began as a surprising and challenging opponent had evolved into the spearhead of an overwhelming aerial armada that was systematically destroying Germany's capacity to wage war. The psychological journey from confidence to concern to desperation mirrored the larger trajectory of the Luftwaffe, and indeed of Nazi Germany itself, as the war progressed. One of the most poignant reflections on this journey comes from Hauptmann Egon Meyer, the pilot who had developed the head-on attack technique against B-17 formations. Promoted rapidly due to his tactical innovations and combat success, Meyer was killed on March 2, 1944, while leading his fighter group against American bombers. In his last letter home, written the night before his final mission, he wrote, "We fight because we must, because it is our duty, but I hold no illusions about the outcome. The Americans build 10 aircraft for every one we produce. Their pilots train in safety, while ours learn in combat. The mighty fortress they have built in the sky grows stronger each day, while our defenses crumble. History will record that we did our duty to the end, but it will not record a German victory in this war of the air. As the Allied bombing campaign reached its peak intensity in the spring and summer of 1944, the B-17 Flying Fortress had cemented its place in aviation history. For the German pilots who faced it in combat, it had represented a paradigm shift in aerial warfare, a bomber that could defend itself so effectively that it fundamentally altered the equation of air combat. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through the entire German war effort. Air superiority, which had been a cornerstone of German military success in the early years of the war, was now irrevocably lost. The consequences extended far beyond the aerial battlefield, as Allied bombers systematically destroyed Germany's industrial capacity, transportation networks, and ultimately its ability to continue the war. In the summer of 1944, as Allied ground forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches and American bombers continued to pound German targets, a Luftwaffe intelligence assessment concluded the American Flying Fortress has proven to be the most significant aerial weapon of this war. Its ability to absorb punishment, deliver its payload, and return to base has exceeded all expectations. Our failure to develop an effective countermeasure must be regarded as one of the decisive factors in the current strategic situation. Yet even as German defeat grew increasingly certain, the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots continued to rise to challenge the B-17 formations. Their courage in the face of overwhelming odds speaks to the complex reality of warfare, where individual bravery often coexists with participation in a morally bankrupt cause. These pilots, many still in their early 20s, flew against the mighty fortresses not out of devotion to Nazi ideology, but out of duty to their comrades, their service, and their country, a distinction that would become important in the post-war reconstruction of Germany. As the Allied armies approached Germany's borders in the fall of 1944, fuel shortages began to ground the Luftwaffe more than combat losses had done. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. After years of increasingly desperate combat against overwhelming odds, many now found themselves unable even to take off to defend their homeland. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a leading Luftwaffe ace who would later help rebuild the German Air Force after the war, captured this final psychological blow in his diary. "We stand by our aircraft watching the contrails of hundreds of American bombers crossing the sky, knowing that we cannot reach them. For a fighter pilot, this is the ultimate defeat, not to be shot down in combat, but to be rendered irrelevant, to watch helplessly as the enemy operates with complete freedom. The mighty fortress that is the American bomber fleet now rules our skies completely, and we can only watch as they determine the final chapters of this war." As 1944 drew to a close, the once proud Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shell of its former self. Fuel shortages, combat losses, and the overwhelming Allied air superiority had combined to render it largely ineffective. The final desperate gamble came on January 1, 1945, when nearly 1,000 German aircraft were committed to Operation Bodenplatte, a massive strike against Allied airfields in the Low Countries. The operation achieved tactical surprise but resulted in devastating losses for the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter strength, particularly in experienced pilots who could not be replaced. For the German pilots who had faced the B-17 from its first appearance in European skies, the journey had come full circle. What began as a shocking encounter with an unexpected defensive capability had evolved into a symbol of Germany's strategic defeat in the air war. The Flying Fortress, true to its name, had helped establish an impregnable American dominance of the skies that would continue until the final German surrender in May 1945. Yet even as the war drew to its inevitable conclusion, the legend of the B-17 continued to grow in the minds of the German pilots who had faced it. In the harsh reality of defeat, there was a certain professional respect for an adversary that had proven so formidable. This would be reflected in post-war accounts by Luftwaffe veterans, many of whom would emphasize the technical excellence of the B-17 and the bravery of its crews, even as they recounted their own experiences trying to shoot it down. The final word perhaps belongs to General Adolf Galland, who commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter force during most of the war against the Flying Fortress. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The American B-17 Flying Fortress changed the nature of aerial warfare. When we first encountered it, we were unprepared for its defensive capabilities. By the time we developed tactics to counter it effectively, the Americans had deployed it in such numbers and with such formidable escort fighters that the outcome was inevitable." If the history of the air war in Europe teaches us anything, it is that technical superiority, industrial capacity, and strategic vision ultimately prevail over even the most skilled and determined opposition. The Flying Fortress exemplified all three of these advantages, and in doing so, it helped write the final chapters of the Third Reich. As the war entered its final phase in early 1945, the confrontation between German fighters and B-17 Flying Fortresses took on an almost ritualistic quality. Luftwaffe pilots, now operating with severe restrictions on fuel and flying time, would marshal their dwindling resources for desperate attacks against the ever-present American bomber streams. The psychological dimension of these final encounters reflected the broader collapse of the Third Reich, a combination of fatalism, desperation, and in some cases, a strange form of professional pride in continuing to perform their duty even as defeat became inevitable. The American bombing campaign had evolved significantly since those first tentative raids in 1942. By 1945, the 8th Air Force alone could dispatch over 1,000 heavy bombers on a single mission, escorted by nearly as many fighters. The B-17G, the definitive production model of the Flying Fortress, now featured even more formidable defensive armament than the earlier models that had first shocked German pilots, including the Chin turret with dual 50-caliber machine guns that eliminated the frontal vulnerability Luftwaffe tactics had sought to exploit. For the remaining Luftwaffe pilots, many now flying the exceptional but too late to matter Mi-62 jet fighter, the challenge of intercepting these massive formations had become nearly insurmountable. Oberleutnant Hans Fey of Jagdgeschwader 7, one of the jet fighter units, described the psychological impact in his post-war memoir. "We would climb toward the bomber stream, knowing that we had perhaps 3 minutes of combat time before our fuel would force us to return to base." American escorts waited above like hawks. The B-17s flew on in their perfect formations, seeming almost contemptuous of our efforts to disrupt their mission. We would make one pass, perhaps damage or destroy a bomber, and then flee before the Mustangs could catch us. It was no longer aerial combat in any traditional sense. It was an exercise in survival, with symbolic gestures of resistance. The focus of the Allied bombing campaign had shifted by this point. While German aircraft production remained a priority target, increasing emphasis was placed on transportation networks, oil refineries, and synthetic fuel plants. The strategic logic was clear. Even if Germany could somehow continue producing aircraft, without fuel, they would be useless. This shift created a self-reinforcing cycle of deterioration for the Luftwaffe, as each successful attack on fuel production further reduced their ability to defend against subsequent raids. The psychological impact on the German population was equally significant. The initial shock of American daylight raids had given way to a grim resignation. As German cities came under round-the-clock bombardment, American B-17s and B-24s by day, British Lancasters and Halifaxes by night. Air raid sirens, once a call to action for civil defense, increasingly signaled a retreat to shelters with little expectation that Luftwaffe interceptors would prevent the impending destruction. Werner Milders, one of the Luftwaffe's earliest tactical innovators, had not lived to see this final deterioration, having died in a plane crash in 1941. But the fighter wing that bore his name, Jagdgeschwader 51 Milders, continued to operate until the final days of the war. Its pilots experienced the full evolution of the air war against the B-17, from the initial shocking encounters to the final futile intercepts of 1945. Oberstleutnant Günther Josten, who commanded the unit in the war's final months, provided a stark assessment in his last operational report. "We are witnessing the complete collapse of German air defense. Our pilots now have less than 20 hours of training before facing combat veterans in superior aircraft. Fuel allocations allow for only one combat sortie every 3 days. Maintenance personnel work miracles with inadequate parts and tools. Yet the men continue to fly when ordered, knowing that their chances of survival, let alone success, diminish with each passing day." The human dimension of this final phase of the air war reveals much about the psychology of combat in a losing cause. Some Luftwaffe pilots, particularly those who had survived years of combat against the Flying Fortress, developed a fatalistic professionalism. They would continue to perform their duty to the best of their ability, without illusions about the strategic outcome. Others, especially younger pilots with minimal training and experience, exhibited signs of what modern psychology would recognize as acute stress reaction, including anxiety, recklessness, or paralysis in combat situations. A Luftwaffe flight surgeon attached to Jagdgeschwader 3 noted in February 1945, "Pilots are reporting increasing difficulty sleeping and concentrating. Some experienced aviators maintain their composure through force of habit and discipline, but newer pilots often exhibit either extreme aggression or hesitation in combat. Neither is conducive to survival. Medical interventions are limited by lack of resources and the operational tempo. The most effective treatment would be relief from combat duties, but this is obviously impossible, given our current personnel situation." The psychological strain extended to ground personnel as well. Mechanics and armament specialists worked around the clock with dwindling supplies, often at airfields under direct threat of bombing or approaching ground forces. The knowledge that their efforts could only delay, not prevent, defeat, created a uniquely demoralizing work environment. Yet many continued to perform their duties with remarkable dedication, a testament to the power of unit cohesion and professional identity even in the most adverse circumstances. For American B-17 crews, this final phase of the air war brought its own psychological challenges. While the threat from Luftwaffe interceptors had diminished significantly, it had not disappeared entirely. German flak defenses remained formidable until the final weeks of the war, and the sporadic but deadly attacks by Me-262 jets introduced a new element of uncertainty. The bomber crews also contended with the moral burden of their missions, as bombing operations increasingly affected civilian areas, despite continuing emphasis on military and industrial targets. Captain Robert Morgan, who had piloted the famous B-17F Memphis Belle through its complete 25-mission tour in 1943, returned to combat in 1945 as a B-29 commander in the Pacific. In comparing his experiences, he highlighted the psychological differences. "When we flew the Belle against the Germans, we knew we were facing the best fighter pilots and anti-aircraft defenses in the world. Every mission was a dice roll." By 1945, the boys flying fortresses over Germany were still in danger, but the odds had shifted dramatically in their favor. The psychological pressure was different, less about survival, more about completing the job and going home. The changing dynamics of the air war were not lost on the German High Command. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had essentially abandoned any pretense of a coherent air defense strategy. Instead, remaining resources were allocated to a series of increasingly desperate measures, from the formation of the volunteer Sonderkommando Elbe suicide ramming unit to the last-ditch deployment of the Heinkel He 162 Volksjäger, people's fighter, a simplified jet fighter that could be built quickly using minimal strategic materials and piloted by hastily trained Hitler Youth members. The psychological dimension of these measures reflected the broader Nazi regime's descent into apocalyptic thinking in its final months, where rather than seeking a rational end to a war that was clearly lost, the leadership doubled down on symbolic gestures of resistance and increasingly fantastical visions of wonder weapons that might yet turn the tide. For the pilots tasked with implementing these desperate strategies, the psychological burden was immense. They were being asked to sacrifice themselves, not for an achievable victory, but for a regime whose moral bankruptcy was becoming increasingly evident even to its most loyal supporters. Oberst Gordon Golub, a highly decorated ace who served in the Luftwaffe's headquarters staff during this period, later reflected, "By 1945, we were no longer conducting military operations in any meaningful sense. We were engaged in a kind of deadly theater, pretending that our actions could still affect the outcome of the war. The young men we sent against the American bombers were sacrifices on the altar of a false god who had already abandoned them. Those of us in positions of authority knew this, yet we continued to issue orders and pretend that they served some purpose beyond prolonging the inevitable." The final months of the war saw a significant number of Luftwaffe pilots attempting to save their aircraft and German civilians through acts of surrender or desertion. Johannes Steinhoff, who had been severely burned in a Me-262 crash in April 1945, later estimated that at least 15% of our operational strength in the final weeks was lost not to enemy action, but to pilots who simply flew west or north and landed at Allied airfields. This represented a final psychological breaking point for men who had, in many cases, fought with distinction for years, but who could no longer reconcile their professional duty with service to a regime engaged in obvious atrocities and futile sacrifice. For those German pilots who continued to intercept B-17 formations until the very end, the experience left indelible psychological marks that would influence their post-war lives and careers. Many struggled with the dual legacy of having displayed unquestionable courage in combat while having done so in service to a genocidal regime. Others found a degree of redemption in the knowledge that they had conducted themselves as professionals in a military capacity, following the laws of armed conflict, even as the Nazi leadership abandoned all moral constraints. Hans Ulrich Rudel, Germany's most highly decorated pilot, though he flew ground attack aircraft rather than fighters, expressed a sentiment shared by many of his colleagues when he wrote after the war, "We fought for Germany, not for Hitler. We fought as soldiers, not as politicians. The bomber crews we faced in combat were our enemies in war, but not in humanity. They did their duty as we did ours." That both sides could recognize this professional reality, even in the midst of total war, gives me hope that civilization can survive even its darkest chapters. This sentiment was echoed in the numerous instances of mutual respect that developed between former adversaries after the war. Adolf Galland, who had commanded the Luftwaffe fighter force for much of the conflict, became friends with Robert Bob Johnson, one of the top-scoring American aces of the European theater. Former B-17 crews and the German pilots who had tried to shoot them down occasionally reunited at aviation events and military commemorations, finding common ground in their shared experiences of aerial combat. The technological and tactical legacy of the confrontation between German fighters and the B-17 Flying Fortress would shape military aviation for decades to come. The post-war United States Air Force, established as an independent service branch in 1947, incorporated many lessons from the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, while the Soviet Union and Western powers alike studied the Luftwaffe's evolving countermeasures as they developed their own air defense systems for the Cold War era. The B-17's fundamental innovation, the concept of a heavily armed bomber capable of defending itself within a mutually supporting formation, would eventually be rendered obsolete by advances in radar, guided missiles, and supersonic interceptors. By the time of the Korean War in the early 1950s, jet-powered bombers like the B-47 Stratojet relied primarily on high altitude, high speed, and later electronic countermeasures for survival rather than defensive gunnery. Yet the psychological impact of the Flying Fortress on its German adversaries had demonstrated a crucial principle that would remain relevant. The effectiveness of an aircraft in combat depends not just on its technical specifications, but on its ability to create uncertainty and fear in the minds of enemy pilots. This psychological dimension of aerial warfare would be institutionalized in post-war military doctrines around the world. Air combat training increasingly incorporated psychological conditioning to help pilots manage the extreme stress of combat maneuvering while making split-second decisions. The United States Navy's famous Top Gun program, established in 1969 during the Vietnam War, explicitly addressed the psychological factors that had contributed to unexpectedly poor performance by American pilots against tactically inferior North Vietnamese MiGs, a scenario with interesting parallels to the initial German experience against B-17s. For the German pilots who survived their encounters with the Flying Fortress and the war itself, the post-war period brought varying degrees of reckoning and rehabilitation. Many, particularly those who had not been members of the Nazi Party or SS, were eventually able to rebuild their lives and careers. Some, like Johannes Steinhoff and Günter Rau, played significant roles in establishing the Air Force of the new Federal Republic of Germany in the 1950s, bringing with them the hard-won lessons of their combat against American strategic bombing formations. The Bundesluftwaffe, established in 1956 as part of West Germany's rearmament within NATO, incorporated many former Luftwaffe pilots who had faced the B-17 in combat. Their experiences informed the new Air Force's doctrine, particularly regarding the integration of air defense within the broader NATO strategy of containing Soviet power in Europe. The psychological scars of their defeat remained, but were gradually transformed into a professional determination to build something new and honorable from the ashes of the past. Adolf Galland, who had commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter force during the critical phases of the air war against the B-17, reflected in 1970. What we learned from our experience against the American daylight bombing campaign was that no single aircraft, no matter how advanced, can change the course of a war without the industrial capacity to produce it in sufficient numbers and the strategic vision to employ it effectively. The B-17 was a formidable opponent, but its true strength lay in the American ability to produce thousands of them, train their crews efficiently, and deploy them as part of a coherent strategic concept. These lessons are not unique to air warfare, but apply to all aspects of modern conflict. The veterans of the air war over Europe, both American and German, gradually aged and diminished in number as the decades passed. With each passing year, the first-hand experience of what it meant to fly a B-17 into the teeth of German defenses or to face the wall of fire from a formation of flying fortresses receded further into history. Yet the psychological impact of these experiences continued to resonate through the accounts, memoirs, and oral histories that surviving participants shared with younger generations. Walter Krupinski, a Luftwaffe ace who survived numerous encounters with B-17 formations and later rose to the rank of lieutenant general in the Bundesluftwaffe, emphasized the psychological dimension in his training of new German pilots during the Cold War. The most important quality of a fighter pilot is not his technical skill, though that is essential, but his mental resilience, his ability to make decisions under extreme pressure when the consequences of both action and inaction may be fatal. This was the great lesson of our combat against the American bomber formations. Those who could master their fear and think clearly despite the chaos around them were the ones who survived and succeeded. The B-17 Flying Fortress itself, the aircraft that had created such psychological havoc among its German adversaries, transitioned into a variety of post-war roles before gradually being retired from military service. Some served as early warning radar platforms, others as air-sea rescue aircraft or aerial tankers. A few were converted for civilian use as firefighting air tankers or cargo haulers. By the 1960s, most had been scrapped, with only a handful preserved in museums or maintained in flying condition by dedicated enthusiasts and historical foundations. For the American public, the B-17 became an enduring symbol of their country's contribution to the Allied victory in Europe. Films like 12 O'Clock High, 1949, and The War Lover, 1962, dramatized the bomber crew's experiences, while technical accounts and memoirs filled in the historical details of the strategic bombing campaign. The distinctive silhouette of the Flying Fortress, with its clear plexiglass nose and bristling gun positions, became one of the most recognizable aircraft profiles in aviation history, instantly evocative of American industrial might and strategic bombing power. Less frequently acknowledged in these popular accounts was the psychological impact the B-17 had on those tasked with intercepting it. The German perspective on the strategic bombing campaign remained largely unknown to American audiences until the publication of works like Adolf Galland's The First and the Last, in English translation, in 1954. Even then, Cold War politics tended to simplify the narrative, casting former German combatants as either unreconstructed Nazis or prescient anti-communists, with little room for the complex human reality that lay between these extremes. The full psychological dimension of the air war, the fear, respect, determination, and eventual resignation experienced by German pilots as they confronted the evolving threat of the B-17, emerged only gradually through scholarly studies, translated memoirs, and oral history projects in the latter decades of the 20th century. These accounts revealed a more nuanced picture of the aerial battlefield where professional respect coexisted with national enmity, and where the human factors of courage, fear, exhaustion, and duty played as significant a role as the technical specifications of the aircraft involved. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in aviation history with 352 confirmed victories, though primarily on the Eastern Front against Soviet aircraft, summarized this human dimension in a 1978 interview. Aircraft do not fight aircraft. Men fight men. The machine is simply the tool, the extension of the pilot's will and skill. What made the American bomber offensive so formidable was not just the quality of their flying fortresses or the quantity of their production, but the determination and resourcefulness of the men who flew them and the strategic vision of those who directed their operations. We Germans had excellent aircraft and many skilled pilots, but we lacked the industrial capacity to replace our losses and, ultimately, the strategic framework that would have given meaning to our tactical successes. This human perspective on the air war provides the most enduring lesson of the confrontation between German fighters and the B-17 Flying Fortress. Beyond the technical specifications, production statistics, and tactical innovations, the psychological dimension of aerial combat, the impact of fear, uncertainty, exhaustion, and morale, played a decisive role in determining the outcome. The B-17 earned its reputation as a flying fortress, not just through its defensive armament and structural durability, but through the psychological effect these qualities had on the German pilots who faced it in combat. The legacies of these psychological effects continued to influence military aviation long after the B-17 itself had been retired from service. Modern air combat training programs place significant emphasis on psychological conditioning, recognizing that a pilot's ability to function effectively under extreme stress is as important as their technical flying skills. Combat aircraft are designed not just to destroy enemy planes, but to create uncertainty and fear in enemy pilots, disrupting their decision-making process and degrading their combat effectiveness. The confrontation between German fighters and the B-17 Flying Fortress also offers broader lessons about the nature of technological innovation in warfare. The initial shock experienced by Luftwaffe pilots when encountering the B-17's defensive capabilities demonstrates how technological surprises can create disproportionate psychological effects even before their full tactical impact is felt. This principle has been repeatedly demonstrated in subsequent conflicts, from the introduction of precision-guided munitions in the Vietnam War to the deployment of stealth aircraft in the Gulf War. Yet the German response to the B-17 threat also shows the limitations of tactical adaptation in the face of strategic disadvantage. The Luftwaffe developed increasingly effective methods for attacking B-17 formations, from the head-on attack pioneered by Egon Mayer to the deployment of air-to-air rockets and heavily armed specialized interceptors. But these tactical innovations could not overcome the fundamental strategic realities. American industrial production could replace bomber losses faster than Germany could train new pilots, and the introduction of long-range escort fighters negated the limited success the Luftwaffe had achieved against unescorted formations. This interplay between tactical innovation and strategic context remains relevant to modern military planning. No weapon system, no matter how advanced, exists in isolation from broader strategic realities. The effectiveness of any military technology depends not just on its inherent capabilities, but on how it is integrated into a coherent operational concept, supported by appropriate training, logistics, and doctrine, and employed within a realistic strategic framework. For the German pilots who faced the B-17 in combat, this harsh truth became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Their initial shock at the bomber's defensive capabilities gave way to tactical adaptation, which in turn gave way to strategic resignation as the full weight of American industrial production and technological innovation made itself felt. The psychological journey from confidence to concern to desperation mirrored the larger trajectory of the Luftwaffe and the Third Reich itself. In the final analysis, the confrontation between German fighters and the B-17 Flying Fortress represented more than just a contest between aircraft types or tactical systems. It embodied the broader struggle between different conceptions of air power, different industrial capacities, and different strategic visions. The American approach centered on daylight precision bombing supported by industrial mass production prevailed over the German emphasis on tactical excellence and technological sophistication without adequate strategic direction or industrial support. The psychological impact of this confrontation, the fear and respect the B-17 instilled in its German adversaries, stands as a testament to the effectiveness of the American approach. The Flying Fortress earned its formidable reputation not just through its technical specifications, but through its psychological effect on those who faced it in combat. In this sense, the terrifying surprise experienced by German pilots when they first encountered the B-17 over Europe was not just a tactical setback, but a harbinger of strategic defeat. Today, as aviation historians and military analysts continue to study the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, the psychological dimension of the air war offers valuable insights into the human factors that shape combat effectiveness. Beyond the statistics of aircraft production, bomb tonnage, and casualty figures lies the less quantifiable but equally important realm of morale, determination, fear, and courage. The psychological battlefield where the confrontation between German fighters and the B-17 Flying Fortress was ultimately decided. The veterans who experienced this confrontation firsthand have nearly all passed away, their direct testimony preserved only in books, recordings, and historical archives. Yet their experiences continue to inform our understanding of aerial warfare and its psychological dimensions. The lessons they learned at such cost about the interaction between technology and psychology in combat, about the importance of industrial capacity and strategic vision, and about the human factors that ultimately determine military effectiveness, remain relevant to contemporary defense planning and military operations. In this sense, the legacy of the confrontation between German fighters and the B-17 Flying Fortress extends far beyond the specific technical and tactical details of World War II aerial combat. It offers enduring insights into the nature of warfare itself, particularly the complex interplay between material factors and human psychology that shapes battlefield outcomes. The terrifying surprise experienced by German pilots when they first encountered the Flying Fortress was not just a moment in aviation history, but a case study in how technological innovation, industrial capacity, strategic vision, and psychological impact combine to determine the course of armed conflict. As we reflect on this history from the vantage point of the 21st century, we can appreciate both the courage of the men who fought on both sides of this aerial battlefield and the broader historical forces that shaped their experiences. The German pilots who rose to intercept the B-17 formations, knowing the odds against them were increasingly insurmountable, displayed remarkable courage and determination, even as they served a regime whose moral bankruptcy became increasingly evident. The American bomber crews who flew mission after mission into the teeth of German defenses, knowing that each sortie could be their last, demonstrated similar qualities in service of a cause that history has judged more favorably. In the final accounting, the confrontation between German fighters and the B-17 Flying Fortress represents both a pivotal moment in military aviation and a microcosm of the larger conflict of which it was a part. The terrifying surprise experienced by Luftwaffe pilots when they first encountered this formidable opponent foreshadowed the eventual outcome of the air war over Europe and, by extension, of World War II itself. In this sense, the story of the Flying Fortress and its impact on its German adversaries remains not just historically significant, but instructive for our understanding of how wars are fought and won, both in the air and on the psychological battlefield that underlies all military confrontations.